Chosen ones. There are moments when history does not wait for permission to arrive. It simply steps into the room, unannounced, rearranging everything it touches. This was one of those moments. The White House, usually a fortress of calculated order, had grown unnervingly still. Outside, the city continued its restless hum, but inside, the air felt as though it had been pulled tight, straining under an invisible weight. It was not a sound anyone could explain, not a tremor in the ground, nor the drone of passing jets. It was something deeper, a frequency that bypassed the ears and went straight for the marrow. Security cameras caught nothing unusual, yet the walls seemed to inhale, as though they themselves were bracing for what they knew was coming. Secret Service agents shifted in place without knowing why. Aides paused mid-sentence, forgetting what they were about to say. And then it reached him. The president was not in a meeting or on a call. He was alone, reading a brief on diplomatic trade shifts, when the sensation began to bloom in the back of his mind, an almost imperceptible hum that grew into a resonance. His eyes rose from the paper. The room seemed to ripple at the edges. Something beyond language spoke to him, and yet no word was formed. His hand, unprompted, went to the side of his face, as though steadying himself. It was then that his breathing changed. A deep inhalation, an unsteady exhale, and the faintest glisten of a tear catching the light before it fell onto the document in front of him. Not from sorrow, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing. Somewhere beyond the physical boundaries of that office, the source of this resonance was moving. It had crossed state lines, not by car or plane, but by something far older, the kind of transmission that ancient kings feared and prophets recognized. Those walls had heard many things: declarations of war, the signing of peace treaties, whispers of betrayal, but they had never heard this. The paper was supposed to be just another report, the kind that passed across the president's desk daily. It was filled with statistics, projections, coded phrases only a few in the world could decipher. But now, the ink bore something it had never carried before, the mark of a single tear, faint but undeniable, a distortion in the fibers that no archivist could ever explain. He stared at it, as if by looking long enough, the reason for its presence would reveal itself. Around him, the air still carried that subtle hum from earlier, like the lingering note of a struck tuning fork. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, embedded somewhere deep within him. The aides came in and out of the room as usual, careful not to disturb him, unaware of the shift that had already taken place. His mind kept wandering to the sensation he'd felt when it first began, the way it seemed to bypass all thought and pierce directly into something beyond reason. It was as though the sound carried an image, a presence, even a knowing, but not one that words could hold. He placed his fingertips lightly on the tear's path, tracing its faint edge. This wasn't emotion in the conventional sense. It was more like recognition, as if he had seen a figure standing in a place he could not name, waiting for him in silence. The room's colors seemed sharper now. The white walls felt less like stone, and more like a surface holding back something vast. Somewhere in the West Wing, a clock chimed. Not loudly, but it startled him nonetheless. He thought he heard it echo in a way clocks were not supposed to echo, as though the sound had traveled much farther than the hallway. The paper lay before him like an artifact. The seal at the top, the printed words beneath, all meaningless compared to the one imperfection it now bore. The tear was not an accident. It felt deliberate, almost invited. There was no instruction for this in any handbook, no security protocol for a presence that could not be seen, no line in the chain of command for what moved unseen through the air and left leaders silent. And yet, he knew this was only the first mark it would leave. The Situation Room had always been a place of precision, its atmosphere sharpened by urgency and absolute control. Every chair, every monitor, every flicker of data on the screens was arranged to channel authority. Yet on that morning, the room felt different, as if its walls had absorbed something ancient overnight. The advisors filed in one by one, carrying their folders and guarded expressions. The president entered last, his gaze distant, still carrying the weight of what had happened in the Oval Office. The moment he crossed the threshold, a strange stillness took hold. Screens flickered, not with static, but with the briefest distortion, a thin shimmer that came and went in less than a breath. It was the communications director who noticed it first. In the lower corner of one live satellite feed, the image was not of sky or land, but of shapes forming and dissolving like ripples on water. The sound engineer adjusted the audio, and that's when it came, faint, woven into the feed itself, a pattern of tones too deliberate to be dismissed as interference. Someone whispered that it sounded like a song. Another insisted it was a code. But, to the president, it was neither, and both. He had heard this cadence before, though not in this life. The tones moved with the rhythm of a psalm, the kind once recited by shepherds under starlit hills. The words were unspoken, but the meaning pressed itself into the soul, carrying the echo of a promise made long before any throne or government existed. It was not lost on him that Yeshua had spoken of such moments, when truth would not come through the lips of leaders or prophets, but through stones, winds, and even the silent weight of presence. This was one of those moments. The room's screens returned to their normal displays, and the sound faded, leaving behind the faint vibration in the floor, as though the building itself had kept a piece of the message. The staff glanced at one another, unsure whether to speak of what they had just heard. The president sat in his chair, silent, his fingertips pressed together. Whatever had entered this room had not come to stay, but neither had it come to leave entirely. It had simply passed through, leaving a trace, like ink invisible until the right light finds it. In the quiet of the late evening, the Oval Office held a dim glow from a single lamp on the corner of the resolute desk. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving the corridors empty and the hum of the city beyond the gates muffled. The president sat alone, pages of classified reports spread before him, though he had read none in the last hour. His attention was fixed on the lamp. It had flickered once, not in the way of an unstable bulb or a failing connection, but with a measured pulse, as though it had taken a deliberate breath. He waited, telling himself it was nothing, yet deep down he already knew better. The second flicker came minutes later, softer, almost hesitant. The light dimmed, then returned, steady and clear. Each time it seemed less like an object reacting to an electrical fault and more like an act of acknowledgement. He leaned back, letting his gaze soften, watching without expectation. The air in the room felt subtly heavier, not oppressive, but charged, as though the space between him and the lamp was filled with something unseen. The shadows on the carpet shifted ever so slightly, bending toward the desk before settling again. Somewhere in the building, a door closed, though no footsteps followed. The sound reverberated faintly in the walls, traveling in a way sound normally would not. The president wondered if it was a coincidence, or if the lamp, the air, and the unseen weight were all connected, parts of a single presence that had been building since that first tear fell earlier in the day. His mind wandered to the possibility that the flickers were not meant for him alone, that someone, somewhere else, was seeing or feeling the same pattern in another room entirely. The idea unsettled him, but it also brought an odd sense of connection, as though this was not an intrusion, but a link. The lamp steadied once more, its warm light casting a clear circle over the desk, yet the feeling lingered that this was only a pause in whatever was unfolding. The glow on the wood looked almost like a signal waiting to be read, patient but unyielding. Somewhere beyond the walls, the current continued to move. The cabinet room was designed for decisive action. Long table polished to a mirrored finish, high-backed chairs aligned with military precision, flags standing sentinel in each corner. Meetings here were usually rapid, voices overlapping, pens scratching, papers shuffled in controlled chaos. But on this day, silence claimed every seat before the agenda even began. They had gathered for a national security update. Briefcases clicked open, tablets lit up, and yet no one spoke. The president's gaze wandered across the table, noticing how the sheen of the wood seemed different, as though a thin veil of light had settled over it. The overhead fixtures hummed softly, but beneath that hum was something else, a cadence, like the faint echo of words carried from a distance. At first, he thought it was his mind replaying the strange psalm from the Situation Room, but this was slower, deliberate, and impossibly gentle. The syllables were not in English, nor in any modern tongue, yet they pressed against the heart in perfect clarity. It was a verse, one he had never learned, yet somehow had always known. A memory stirred, not of his own life, but of something older. A voice speaking by the shore of Galilee, not to leaders or armies, but to fishermen and wanderers, saying that kingdoms rise and fall. But the truth, carried in the breath of Yeshua, endures beyond the reach of time. That voice, unmistakable in its tone, seemed to breathe through the still air of the room. No one else spoke, though it was clear they felt it too. Some shifted in their seats, their eyes darting without purpose. One advisor's pen hovered over a notepad but did not move. The seconds stretched until they no longer felt like seconds. The president let his hands rest on the table's edge, fingertips brushing the smooth grain. He could almost feel the words running through it, as if they had been etched into the wood itself. The air felt lighter now, yet more grounded, as though gravity itself had shifted to accommodate what had just entered. Then, as suddenly as it began, the verse was gone. Only the muted hum of the lights remained. But in the shared glance of those present, it was clear. They knew something had been spoken into the room that no record or transcript could ever hold. The meeting had ended, but the weight of it lingered like an unshakable shadow. The president stayed behind in the cabinet room, exchanging a few low words with his chief aide before sending the others away. The aide remained, seated at the far end of the table with a notepad before him, pen resting between his fingers. They were to finalize the next set of orders. Nothing extraordinary, just standard follow-up after high-level discussions. Yet the aide's hand did not move. His gaze was fixed on the paper, as though it had transformed into something unfamiliar. The president watched quietly, noting the way the man's breathing slowed, his shoulders stiffened, and his fingers tightened, but refused to press the pen to the page. "Is something wrong?" the president asked, though he already suspected the answer might not be simple. The aide looked up, eyes distant, as if focusing required effort. "It feels like if I write this, it won't be my words." He tried to smile, to mask the unease, but the pen still hovered in place. The room's air felt unnaturally still again, the kind of stillness that wasn't silence, but anticipation. The president glanced at the notepad and noticed the faintest indentation on the top sheet, not from the aide's pen, but from something pressed into the paper beforehand. It was a single curve, incomplete, as though part of a letter in a language he couldn't recognize. The aide's hand trembled slightly, and he set the pen down as though it had grown too heavy. "It's like the words are already here," he murmured. "But they're not meant for me to put down." Somewhere deep within the building, a vent released a soft rush of air. Yet the temperature in the room did not change. The light overhead dimmed by a fraction, the kind of imperceptible shift most would ignore. The president, however, noticed every detail. The way the shadows lengthened toward the aide's hands, the way the paper seemed to hold something unspoken. The aide finally slid the notepad forward, as if surrendering it. The page was still blank, but the sense that it was not empty at all hung heavy between them. Neither man reached for it. The pen lay untouched on the polished table, waiting for a hand that might not belong to either of them. The Oval Office was quiet, the kind of quiet that seemed to press in from every side. The president stood near the center, his gaze drawn downward to the great seal woven into the carpet beneath his feet, the eagle's outstretched wings, the stars, the olive branch and arrows, all symbols he had seen countless times. But today, something different caught his attention. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a trick of the light. A slant of sun filtered through the tall windows, catching the seal at an angle that made its colors shift. Yet as he stepped slightly to the side, the shimmer didn't fade. In the center, just above the eagle's head, where the blue curved into the white, a faint but unmistakable outline appeared, a cross, thin and perfect, as though it had always been there but hidden in plain sight. He crouched down, his fingertips brushing the threads. There was no difference in texture, no raised edge to explain it. But when he leaned back, the cross remained, glowing faintly as though lit from within. In that moment, a memory rose unbidden. The story of Yeshua walking into the temple, overturning the tables of those who had turned sacred space into commerce. The voice in that memory was calm but unyielding, speaking of truth that could not be bought or silenced. That same tone seemed to hum in the air now, as if the reflection on the seal was not merely light, but a reminder of something far greater than politics or power. He sat in the chair behind the resolute desk, his eyes still fixed on the reflection. Outside, a shadow passed across the south lawn, though no helicopter had landed, no clouds moved overhead. It was as if the room had briefly shifted into another time, one in which symbols did not just represent, they revealed. The president leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk's edge, feeling the faint vibration in the wood beneath his palms. He wondered how many before him had stood in this exact spot, unaware of what lay hidden in the seal's weave. The cross shimmered once more, then began to fade, though its presence lingered like the echo of a bell struck far away, still vibrating through the air. The West Wing corridors had their own rhythm. The measured click of shoes on polished floors, the low hum of voices behind closed doors, the occasional metallic rattle of a service cart being wheeled somewhere out of sight. On this night, however, the rhythm was broken. The president walked alone, his steps slow, deliberate. Security was posted as always, but no one crossed his path. It was as though the entire floor had been cleared without his request. His footsteps echoed more sharply than usual, each one carrying a faint resonance that seemed to linger longer than the distance should allow. At the far end of the hallway, a single light flickered, then steadied again. He paused, listening. There were other footsteps now, soft, measured just behind him. He turned, but the corridor stretched empty, the security post at the corner unmanned. The sound faded, then returned, this time ahead of him. It was not the hurried pace of someone catching up, nor the heavy march of authority. It was a steady, patient tread, like someone walking a familiar path they had walked countless times before. The air felt different here, cooler, though the thermostat never wavered. As he continued forward, the echoes began to layer, as if more than one set of feet walked with him, their presence neither seen nor fully heard, but felt in the hollow spaces between each sound. The walls seemed to lean inward, not in menace, but in focus, as though the hallway itself was narrowing toward a single point. He passed a framed photograph on the wall, one he had seen many times, a handshake between two former leaders. Tonight, however, the glass over the image caught his eye. In the reflection, he thought he saw a figure walking beside him, though his own frame was the only one in the hall when he turned. The footsteps finally ceased as he reached the heavy double doors leading back toward the Oval Office. He hesitated before opening them, the stillness pressing in once more. The sound had vanished, yet the sense of being accompanied remained, as if the echo itself had simply stepped ahead of him, waiting in the next room. It was past midnight when the president returned to the Oval Office. The lamps cast a soft amber glow over the room, shadows stretching long across the carpet. He moved behind the resolute desk, intending to review a final brief before leaving. But the moment he sat down, something shifted beneath his feet. At first, he thought it was the desk settling, an old piece of furniture adjusting under weight. But then came a faint, deliberate sound, like a thin crack traveling through wood. He looked down, expecting to see nothing out of place, yet a small sliver of the presidential seal in the carpet appeared darker than the rest, the threads pulled just slightly apart. He reached down, pressing his fingertips against it. The texture was uneven, as though something had split beneath the surface. The sensation that followed was not the give of worn fabric, but the subtle snap of something breaking open. It wasn't loud, yet it carried in the air like a note struck on an unseen instrument. The room's stillness deepened. Even the ticking of the mantel clock seemed to falter. He slid the chair back and crouched lower, his gaze fixed on the disrupted part of the seal. There, in the dim light, was a thin line, perfectly straight, running from one edge of the emblem to the other, an invisible division made visible only now. Without warning, the overhead light dimmed, the room filled with the faintest glimmer, not from any fixture, but from the line itself. It was as if a seal, not just a symbol in thread, but something far older, had been split open beneath him. For a moment, he thought of the ancient scrolls spoken of in whispers, the ones sealed until the appointed time. The air seemed to hum in recognition, carrying with it the weight of something sacred now exposed. He did not know if this was meant as a warning, a summons, or both. The glow from the line faded as quickly as it had come, leaving the carpet unchanged, the fibers lying flat once more. But the president knew what he had seen. The seal was not broken in appearance alone. It had been opened in meaning, and whatever had been kept within had already begun to move. The Oval Office clock had always been dependable, a brass-framed piece that marked each second with quiet precision. It had been in the room longer than the current administration, ticking steadily through countless decisions, speeches, and sleepless nights. But tonight, as the president worked alone at the desk, its rhythm faltered. At first, it was only a hesitation, so slight it might have gone unnoticed. A second stretched just a fraction too long before the next click. Then another. The air seemed to lean into the pause, thickening in the space between ticks. He looked up from his papers, eyes drawn to the small hand-carved markings on the clock's face, each numeral steady in its place, each marking unaltered. And yet the hands refused to move. He rose and stepped closer. The clock's pendulum still swayed, slow and even, but the hands had frozen at 11:59. The silence between its faint movements felt heavier than the sound itself. He tapped the glass lightly. No change. For a moment, the room felt suspended, as if time outside the walls continued. But within, everything was held in place. He could hear the distant hum of security radios in the hallway, the faint whir of heating vents, all sounds carrying on as normal. But the air in the Oval Office was different. He placed his palm against the clock, feeling for warmth. Instead, a coolness seeped into his skin, the kind that did not belong to brass or wood, but to something that had traveled far to reach him. It reminded him of standing in a vast, empty place, where the wind should have been moving, but didn't. The clock face reflected his own image faintly, but for a split second, another shape seemed to stand behind him, taller, indistinct, watching without movement. He turned sharply. Nothing. The hands remained at 11:59. It was not late night anymore. It was a threshold. Whatever came next would arrive before the minute turned, yet it was unclear whether that minute would ever end. The president stepped back, leaving the clock untouched, its silent defiance casting a shadow over the room. Time outside would resume without him, but here the hour waited, uncounted, as though the moment itself had chosen not to pass. The East Room was dim, its chandeliers reduced to a faint golden haze that left most of the space in shadow. The president stood alone near the far wall, gazing at the heavy curtains drawn over the tall windows. They had been closed since early evening, but now, without wind or movement, one section swayed gently, as though stirred from the other side. He stepped closer, each footfall muted by the thick carpet. The swaying stopped the moment he reached for the fabric. His hand hovered inches away, sensing a faint current of air. Though there was no gap for it to pass through, it carried with it a sound so soft it could have been imagined. The trace of a voice, barely a breath, yet unmistakably directed toward him. The whisper did not form words in the way human voices did. It was more like the sound of meaning itself, stripped of syllables. He could feel it press against his thoughts, arranging them into an understanding that could not be repeated aloud. It was not a command, nor a warning, but something in between, wrapped in a weight that both anchored and unsettled. For a moment, the atmosphere felt like the pause before a stage performance begins, when the curtain trembles not from air, but from the nearness of what is about to be revealed. He wondered if the voice came from behind the fabric, or from the space beyond the room entirely. The faintest flicker of light slipped through a seam between the panels. It was not sunlight, nor electric glow. It had the muted, steady radiance of something ancient, untouched by time. The whisper rose again, no louder but closer, almost inside his own breathing. It reminded him of a phrase he had once read in a fragment of scripture, that what was spoken in secret would one day be shouted from the rooftops. The voice, if it could be called that, seemed to carry the same inevitability. He reached for the curtain, but stopped just short of touching it. The light dimmed. The whisper faded. The air settled into stillness once more. The president remained there, hand suspended in the quiet, knowing the moment had not passed, but was only waiting for its next return.